Welcome back. This video is on the Age of Exploration. To understand the Age of Exploration in more detail, make sure to visit some of my older videos on the YouTube channel. This is an abbreviated version, so please make sure you're paying attention to the details which I share today. But if you'd like more depth, please refer to those older videos. Okay, let's take a look. The Age of Exploration begins on the Iberian Peninsula in southwest Europe and just north of northern Africa and what we now know today as Morocco. In the 1400s and earlier, for about 200 years, Spanish and Portuguese kingdoms, independent throughout the subcontinent, had been fighting against Muslim forces which had come up through Morocco and northern Africa and into southern Spain and Portugal. These Moorish troops had brought many things like Muslim culture, Arabic, into the Iberian Peninsula, and we still see remnants of that in Spanish and Portuguese culture, and thus you'll see it in South America as well. The Age of Exploration really began because Europeans developed a thirst for spices and goods from Asia. These came from their experiences during the earlier Crusades and also through trade with Muslim empires in what we now know as the Middle East. Muslim empires, however, according to the Europeans, were unfairly trading with the Europeans. This is because of many reasons. First of all, supply and demand. The Muslim forces were in the middle of what we now know as East Asia and Europe. And so as the middlemen, they're going to raise prices to make a better profit on all the goods that they're trading with Europeans or, farther east Asian countries and nations like the Chinese Empire. So Muslim empires were raising the prices, of course, but we also have this disdain between European Christians and Muslim empires because of the Crusades, which occurred for about 400 years in the Middle East. So Europeans sought a way to get around Muslim forces, Muslim nations, in order to get the resources themselves that they yearned for. These things like peppers and spices were most important to them. The things like nutmeg held just as much value as silver and gold to the European peoples because the food of Europe was quite bland. Most of European populations lived in regions where only a few types of crops flourished, and so developing a trade network through themselves and not through the Muslim nations of the Middle East was important. So Europeans began to develop different sailing techniques to go into the ocean and sail around Africa. They began to learn the ways of the wind and the wind patterns and how to construct ships. Leading this charge was the nation of Portugal, and one of their princes, a man by the name of Henry the Navigator, who lived in the 1300s into the 1400s, he developed a school on the Canary Islands off the coast of Africa of navigation and sailing. Things like drawing maps, following and charting a course by the stars, and in essence, how to survive at sea. A little later on, a man by the name of Bartholomew Dias, a Portuguese man, reaches the tip of Africa using the techniques that were developed by Henry the Navigator. Chief among these techniques was the ability to read wind patterns. Off the coast of Africa, most Portuguese vessels would actually start not from the Iberian Peninsula where you have Portugal, but they would actually start off the Canary Islands. And instead of sailing straight down south, according to logic, they actually found out that it was actually easier to sail southwest, where they could pick up wind patterns that blew from west to east, because if they could sail far enough south and catch the wind would actually push them around Africa, which is, completely counter to logic, but it is the best method to sail in the open ocean during those days. So Bartholomew Diaz gets to the tip of Africa, and then a man by the name of Vasco da Gama, also from Portugal, just 10 years later, reaches the region we now know as India. Once reaching India, he was able to trade for many of the goods that Europeans had a thirst for, and he was the first of many Portuguese sailors to emulate the techniques developed by Hurme the Navigator to sail into what we now know as East Asia, or the Far East Indies, India, to reach these goods. What we see is that the Spanish, after finally pushing the Muslims out of the Spanish peninsula, and after years of fighting not only to spread Catholicism back to the peninsula, but also a united kingdom, the monarchs of Spain decided that they needed to gain wealth. They also needed to have something to do with all of these soldiers sitting around who had been fighting for nearly 150 years to remove these very strong Muslim forces from their homeland. So they begin to invest in exploration, just like their neighbors, the Portuguese. A man by the name of Christopher Columbus, an Americanized version of his name, not an Americanized, sorry, but an English version of his name, in 1492, as we all know, discovers America. And we need to dispel a couple myths about Columbus that you may or may have not been taught when you were in elementary school. First of all, Columbus and all of his sailors, all of them, knew that the earth was not flat. Anybody who looks out at the open ocean, especially a sailor, knows that the earth's not flat, because as you look at the horizon, as you look at that flat line, and a ship goes sailing out to sea, what happens to it as it gets to the horizon? It gets smaller and smaller, and then it disappears. And the reason it disappears is because it is going over the horizon. It's going over the roundness of Earth. Everybody knew that the Earth was round, except for the most uneducated, illiterate, and landlocked of peoples. Not the Spanish and the Portuguese, not the Italians who had been sailing and living on the coast for a long, long time. So Christopher Columbus knew what he was doing. He wasn't the only one who knew what he was doing. And so he sails west to get to the Indies. He thinks he gets to the Indies. He comes back thinking he reached the Indies. He's trying to reach India. He takes 2 journeys before somebody else realizes where he went, and he is able to be convinced that he in fact has reached someplace else. Columbus didn't reach the Americas and all of a sudden realize he was interacting with what we now know as Native Americans. He actually thought he was interacting with people from India. So let's continue. The reason they were able to reach such far new places, unlike ever before, was this ship called the Caravel. This is one for your notes. The Caravel was actually a fairly small ocean-going ship, but what made it able to go out in the open ocean was a few things. The rudder, right here, allowed for it to be turned and navigated quite accurately, actually. It gained its power from these sails. The sails all had booms and could be actually angled, raised, and lowered to avoid wear and tear, to avoid being blown off course during a storm, but most importantly, to cut into the wind. Because if the wind was going in the wrong direction and you, as your ship, needed to get through it, if you angle your sails a particular way, you can still use the force of the wind that's blowing you off course to make a fairly good course and cut through the wind. And later ships that you'll hear about in history were actually called the cutters because they also used this design as well. So anyway, these big rectangular and triangular sails allowed for this caravel to reach the open ocean, and again, Columbus could go on his way. we're just going to quickly look at a map here. As you can see, it took quite a while between Henry the Navigator in the early parts of the 1400s and Vasco da Gama in the late parts of the 1400s, before you actually had sailors reaching India. And then of course you get Columbus soon after, trying to go west, not realizing that the Americas were in. Our next video is going to go over the interactions between the people of North and South America and the Europeans, and we're going to talk about a period we now know as contact. Make sure, if you want more detail, to visit our earlier videos or to come up with questions and ask them in class. Thank you for listening to my rambling, and have a good night.